The objectives for today's training are to gain a common understanding of LGBTQ terminology, disparities experienced by the LGBTQ communities, and the legal protections related to gender identity and sexual orientation here in Washington, D.C. We're also going to identify ways that organizations can create inclusive environments for LGBTQ identified individuals. So those environments are conducive to collecting sexual orientation, identity, sexual orientation and gender identity, which we abbreviate as SOGI data. And then finally, we're going to explore different examples of best practices for collecting SOGI data. For today's webinar, we're lucky to have representatives from various DC agencies, including Sam Shinberg, who's the staff social worker with the DC Center, Teresa Rainey, the community outreach coordinator with the DC Office of Human Rights, Amy Nelson, the director of legal services at Whitman Walker Health, and then I will be speaking as a consultant with OVS JG. A few notes about today's presentation. I don't anticipate that we're going to have a long time for a Q&A session, but if we do, we're going to utilize the chat box that's on the lower right-hand side of your screen. First, we want to gain a better understanding of the clients that we're serving. The LGBTQ communities are largely invisible within victim services unless they're specifically asked about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So if we make it standard practice to collect and analyze SOGI data, then we can really assess when and where LGBTQ identified individuals are accessing their services, how satisfied they are with the quality of care that they're receiving. We can also make sure that agencies are delivering appropriate and culturally competent services, because all of our ultimate goal is to help decrease the health and service disparities that we know are experienced by LGBTQ victims of crime. Agencies play a really important role in the experience of a victim of crime and those who are LGBTQ as well. And we know that LGBTQ victims of crime experience disparities in services based on different anecdotes like the one that you see listed up on your screen. What we don't know is whether these stories are isolated or they're part of a larger problem without SOGI data. So as service providers, we want to deliver culturally competent services, and collecting SOGI data is going to help us accomplish that goal. In 2011, Forge conducted a survey, and you can see the results on your screen. In the survey, they asked transgender and gender nonconforming individuals about the different factors that weighed on their decision whether or not to seek services at a different organization. And like most people seeking any type of service, the #1 factor was the reputation of that agency. But what I want you to focus on is if you look at that #2 factor, it was the intake forms, specifically looking at how the agencies asked about gender identity. In the results of the survey, which I'm going to send out as part of that email later today, they found that intake forms that provided more than just options for male and female were the second most important factor that they used when determining whether or not they're going to engage in an agency's services. And this is why SOGI data is important. Not only does it impact an agency's ability to provide comprehensive services by knowing what the experiences of their clients are, but it has a very direct effect on the decision of the client seeking those services. So before we talk about specifics around collecting SOGI data, we first need to make sure that we all have a shared vocabulary. There are many terms associated with sexual orientation and gender identity, and it's important that service providers are able to understand the basic terms that LGBTQ people use to describe their gender identities and their sexual orientations. Because respecting and using these terms appropriately can increase effective and respectful communication. It's also an essential component of culturally competent care. We want to recognize that LGBTQ communities are not homogeneous, they're not all the same. And while there are many common bonds, there are also unique issues that are different for different members of the communities. So I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Sam Shinberg, who's going to discuss LGBTQ cultural competence. Sam?
Thank you, Paige. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us here this morning. So I'm going to do, just as Paige talked about, a little bit of an LGBTQ 101. Some of our goals for this section of the training are to understand language and terminology of LGBTQ populations, explore privilege and discrimination and its role in health outcomes, and learn how to create a more welcoming environment in our workplaces, whatever they may be. So we're going to start with some of the basics. Even without inclusive forms and without being asked, some LGBTQ people will come out themselves. The research shows that some always do. But the more vulnerable a person feels, the riskier it is for him or her to be out. When the facility has a Catholic name, for example, it may feel more dangerous to come out. If a condition being treated is also life-threatening, it can feel unsafe to risk the provider's condemnation or discrimination. The LGBTQ acronym contains two very different groups under the same umbrella term, and this can be confusing for many people. LG and B represent categories of sexual orientation, while the T is the description of a gender identity. These are very different categories. Knowing someone's gender identity, for example, gives no indication about their sexual orientation. A transgender man, T, can be gay, bi, or heterosexual in his attractions. The Q can stand for queer, which is an all-encompassing umbrella term for the community, or for questioning, which recognizes people who may not yet have found a comfortable identity label for themselves, and may never. So we're going to go over some different components of sexual and gender identity. Biological sex refers to hormones, chromosomes, genital and reproductive anatomy. It is a biological classification typically separated into male or female, which you're more likely familiar with. When babies are born, they are usually declared male or female. However, as we know, that classification may not match up with their gender identity, and additionally, for some people, this binary classification doesn't account for the whole of their biological reality. Intersex, or DSD, differences in sexual development, are the terms used to describe people whose anatomy, reproductive organs, hormones, and/or chromosomes do not fit clearly into male or female categories. In other cases, people are born without having either XX or XY chromosomes. They may have XXY chromosomes or a combination of XX and XY. This, of course, would not be apparent by looking at someone. Most intersex people are assigned either male or female at birth and have hormones and/or surgery to help them conform to one of the two generally accepted sexes. But the reality is that male and female are two sides of a continuum, and many people's biological sex falls somewhere in the middle. Sexual orientation addresses who a person is physically and romantically attracted to. If a person is attracted exclusively to people of a different gender, for example, a man is attracted exclusively to women, he would be considered heterosexual. If a man is attracted exclusively to people of the same gender, he would be considered gay or homosexual. If someone is drawn to people both of his gender and of people of different genders, he would be considered bisexual or pansexual, which we will further define later. Sexual orientation does not always perfectly match sexual behavior. For example, a straight, cisgender man could have engaged or be engaging in same-sex sexual practices while still identifying as straight. Sexual experience does not ever negate someone's sexual identity, but both may be important to know as a medical or service provider. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual are identity labels, not descriptions of behavior. If it just referred to all people who had sex at some point in their life with someone of the same gender and at some point in their life someone of a different gender, most people would not be heterosexual. Similarly, if a client or patient tells you she is a lesbian, she may have had sex or relationships with a man at some point in her life, or as recently as last week. If she says she's a lesbian, she's telling you that her attachments to women define her. The only way to know someone's sexual orientation is for them to tell you how they identify. Over 8% of people in this country reported ever having same-sex sexual contact versus the 3.5% who identify as lesbian or gay, and approximately 11% report some same-sex attraction. Here are some common terms that LGBTQ+ identified people may use to identify themselves. It's important to always ask someone about how they identify, rather than assuming you know the answer they will give you. There are many ways to experience LGBTQ+ sexual attraction, as you can see from these slides. Remember that these are all identity labels, just like being straight, and that these terms don't prescribe a specific sexual history. Over 8% of people in this country reported ever having same-sex contact versus the 3.5% who identify as lesbian or gay. And again, approximately 11% report some same-sex attraction. Gender identity is the internal experience of gender. This is usually experienced as identifying or feeling like a man, a woman, a combination of those identities, some other gender entirely, or not identifying with any gender at all. The range of gender identities can be thought of as on a continuum. Someone who identifies as a tomboy, for example, might place herself inside the edge of female, closer to the center of the continuum. For some people, gender identity changes on a daily basis. The only way to know someone's gender identity is to ask them, no matter what. It is important to respect the pronouns and names people use for themselves. Everyone deserves this basic level of respect, whether or not that person fits inside your gender comfort zone. Some other important gender terms are two-spirit. There are other gender terms on this slide, but I wanted to point out two-spirit, which might not be familiar to many people. This is a third gender term common to many First Nation cultures that implies a masculine spirit and feminine spirit residing in the same body. Some people consider two-spirit a term that can refer to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, while others think it is best used for only transgender people. The choice to transition and what transition means is personal and subjective for every transgender person. Unless it is appropriate and absolutely essential for you to know, it is best not to ask for details. The final term to define is gender expression. This refers to the ways people express their masculinity and/or femininity. Please know that gender expression does not line up neatly with someone's gender identity, because gender expression changes daily or even hourly. It isn't a reliable tool to tell what gender someone is. The only way to know someone's gender identity is to ask them when appropriate. For example, there was a time when only men wore pants, and for a woman to do so was considered masculine. The rules of appropriate gender behavior change with time. Well into the last century, boys used to be dressed in pink and girls in blue. Like sex, gender expression can be thought of on a continuum, from very feminine on one end and completely masculine on the other. Most people place themselves somewhere inside the two extremes. A person with male anatomy may dress, speak, and/or behave in a somewhat feminine manner. This doesn't mean that the person is necessarily a transgender woman, but it does mean that this person presents in a feminine way. Similarly, a person with female anatomy who identifies as a woman may have a presentation that could be considered masculine. Gender expression, and however that expression shapes up, is important for all of us to feel comfortable with ourselves moving through the day. Our gender expression doesn't determine our gender identity or align with our biological sex or sexual orientation, but it does guide us in what clothes or hairstyles make us feel comfortable, happy, and more like ourselves. Now we're going to move on to some of the components of sexual and gender identity. Intersectionality is the term used to describe the ways in which oppressive institutions, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, classism, etc., are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another. A key aspect of intersectionality lies in its recognition that multiple oppressions are not each suffered separately, but rather as a single synthesized experience. Most of the facets of identity come with privilege and/or discrimination, and most people are all a unique combination of both. This slide is about privilege. What is privilege? It's a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. There is no real privilege card, but all people are symbolically carrying a few of them in their wallets. Many of these advantages can seem invisible to those who have them. They think of it as normal. Some privileges are earned and some are not. Being white, for example, comes with unearned privileges, while being a doctor comes more from earned privilege. However, earned privileges may be more easily accomplished by those with unearned privileges. People who are beautiful get some privileges. For example, they are more likely to get hired for a job than their less conventionally attractive competitors, even when the job has nothing to do with appearance. White people get the unearned privilege of being able to shop in a store without being watched by the security guard, and empty taxis nearly never pass them without picking them up. Cisgender, gender nonconforming people have the privilege of knowing that they can walk into a public bathroom without danger. Cisgender conforming people. Gender conforming people. Transgender people experience fear and discrimination around public bathrooms every day. An East Asian lesbian may experience discrimination based on her race and sexual orientation, but she may also have the privilege of using the bathroom without fear. Cisgender people take for granted that people won't ask private questions about their genitals, but that is a privilege that most transgender people do not share. Oppression and discrimination are the flip side of privilege. Oppression is carried out on multiple levels simultaneously, and multiple oppressions reinforce each other. Microaggressions, which you see at the top, are everyday verbal or nonverbal indignities targeted, consciously or unconsciously, toward a group of people. It is often unintentionally hurtful, but still convey negative attitudes. In the middle is internalized oppression. That's when a targeted group of people believes, often without being aware, that the negative views towards their own group and in effect use this belief to further police and criticize themselves and those in their group. At the bottom is institutional oppression. That's when policies, laws, traditions, businesses, practices, cultural norms, or other widely practiced and accepted social systems reinforce the inequality between groups of people. The LGBTQ community is diverse and discrimination is not distributed equally. We also have multiple intersecting identities. Transgender women of color are at the greatest risk of being murdered. A report by the Human Rights Campaign found that more transgender people were killed in 2015 than during any other year on record. So now we're going to watch a brief video called Vanessa Goes to the Doctor to illustrate moving an environment from being unfriendly and discriminatory to open and inclusive of all people, including transgender individuals.
I'm really nervous about this appointment. I haven't been to a doctor in years. But finally, I have health insurance. I chose Dr. Miller because he is in my network, but I don't know anything about him.
As a transgender woman of color, Vanessa Shepard has had mixed experiences with doctors and hospitals in the past. But it's the bad ones which stand out in her mind today. So she enters the office with trepidation. Immediately upon entering, she begins to scan the environment for clues. Will she be welcome here? Will she be safe? Do the posters reflect a diverse patient population? Is there a non-discrimination policy posted? No, there is not.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Shepard. I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Dr. Miller.
Looks like this is your first time here. Please fill out all the pages on this form. Bring it back to me when you're finished.
Thank you.
Intake forms are a powerful and early indicator of the safety and welcome LGBT people can expect in a healthcare setting.
What am I supposed to do here? Do I have to lie, or how truthful can I be? Name? I'm just putting Vanessa. Sex? Only 2 choices? I hate this. I guess I have to check male, the sex on my insurance card. Relationship status. With these options, I guess I have to choose only single.
Thank you. Can I have your insurance card, please? I have to make a photocopy of it. You can have a seat and I'll call you. Would you come here, please? You gave me the wrong insurance card. This one says Robert Shepard.
I used to go by Robert Shepard, but now I'm Vanessa Shepard.
So Robert is your real name, and that's the one we're gonna have to use. Have a seat. The doctor will call you.
Mr. Shepard? Mr. Shepard?
That's me.
I called for Mr. Shepard. You are?
I'm Vanessa Shepard.
Okay, come in.
Vanessa is humiliated. Now let's see how it could be done better. Vanessa scans the walls upon entering the waiting room and immediately spots a non-discrimination policy, and yes, it includes both gender identity and sexual orientation.
A rainbow sticker, yes. Oh, and they have the advocate? Great. Hi, my name is Vanessa Shepard. I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Dr. Miller.
Oh, looks like this is your first time here. Please fill out all the pages on this form and bring it back to me when you're finished.
Thank you.
It's immediately clear that this intake form reflects a medical practice with a diverse clientele, and that the providers here want to know who their patients are. The form has a place for Vanessa to write her legal name and her preferred name. It has more than 2 sex options, and a place to indicate she's in a committed relationship.
All done?
Thank you. Can I have your insurance card, please? I have to make a photocopy of it. Have a seat. The doctor will call you.
Excuse me, Ms. Shepard? Hi,
Hi.
welcome.
Thank you.
Come on in.
And now the appointment begins. These first interactions with the provider subtly indicate to LGBT patients whether they can be open or need to be guarded. Let's see what happens between Dr. Miller and Vanessa Shepard.
Just to get started, I saw on your intake form that you did not check off when your last period was.
Yes, I'm a trans woman and I don't get a period.
Oh, so that means you've had the surgery then, right?
No, I don't know what surgery you're referring to that would make me get a period.
Okay, so you have sex with men, which would just mean that you're gay.
No, I'm a woman of trans experience and I identify as lesbian or bisexual.
I have no experience treating patients like you. I really think you need to be seeing an endocrinologist and not me.
Well, I only came in here because I've been coughing for 3 weeks.
This is not going very well for Vanessa. Now let's see what an LGBT welcoming provider might do differently.
I see that on our intake form you checked off that you're transgender. Do you prefer to be called Ms. Shepard?
Yes, I prefer to be called female pronouns, please.
Okay, great. So sorry I got it wrong in the waiting room. Thank you for your patience. Do you currently have a healthcare provider who's providing you with your hormonal treatment?
I do go to a clinic. but it's really far away, so I was hoping that I can do everything today here with you.
While I have experience with the LGBT patient population, I've never been the provider of hormones for a transgendered patient. That said, I think it won't be a problem. I've prescribed hormonal therapy to other patients, and as long as you're willing to be patient with me and we work together, I think that should be okay. The other thing before we get into what brought you in today is I always like to remind my patients how important it is to be tested for HIV. Can you tell me when the last time is that you were tested?
Dr. Miller knows that transgender women of color have particularly high rates of HIV infection due to multiple barriers to care and discrimination. And many HIV-positive women have never been tested.
Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, tell me what it is that brings you in to be seen today.
Well, I've been coughing for 3 weeks. What a terrific doctor. This could be the beginning of a long relationship.
As we've seen, a doctor's appointment is a complicated set of interactions with the environment, with forms, and with the healthcare staff. There are many places to get it wrong and many opportunities to do it right.
The main message, I think, translates pretty well, which is basically that creating a welcoming environment can make all the difference. Using correct pronouns, asking a person about their experience and what they want and need, it really does make all the difference. From turning an environment from being unfriendly and discriminatory to open and inclusive of all people. An agency's message of inclusion and welcome, or unintentional lack of welcome, is made in the very first interaction clients have with the organization. It may be on a website, in health promotional materials, and/or in clinic signage once inside the door. But a message is often already delivered before the client ever sees the culturally competent provider in his or her office. These are quiet messages, but they can be heard loudly and clearly by LGBTQ people. And these are some examples of ways to make service provider offices more inclusive, just having these signs up in any kind of office. Gender-neutral bathrooms are not just kind, they offer basic safety to transgender and gender non-conforming people. Fear and intolerance has been unnecessarily created around the use of non-gender neutral public restrooms by transgender people, and trans people report harassment and abuse simply while trying to pee. So this is kind of a cool campaign to put on restrooms to help be more inclusive. I just wanted to include that little graphic. I think it's very cute. I love the talking toilet. So how to build trust in your organization. Conduct an LGBTQ needs assessment. Engage in regular cultural competency trainings like this one. Include LGBTQ goals in your action plans. Co-brand with LGBTQ trusted groups. Promote your organization through LGBTQ media channels and give grants to LGBTQ agencies. It is perfectly natural to feel awkward when learning to use new language, new skills, and interact with new kinds of people. Comfort increases with experience. It's also okay to make an error. People appreciate that providers are trying. If a provider makes a mistake in referring to someone's name, just like you saw in the video, if they make a mistake referring to someone's name, pronoun, significant other, or body part, simply apologize and move on. Try to avoid explanations about why the mistake was made. So that concludes my part of the presentation, and thank you all so much for having me.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. And just to kind of piggyback off of what Sam was saying, there are many ways that your organization can start working towards creating an inclusive work environment. In addition to what we saw in the video and what Sam talked about, you want to make sure that all of your staff are trained on LGBTQ inclusivity. Everyone from caseworkers to intake personnel, the housekeeping staff, administrative staff, they all have a really direct impact on the client's experience. We saw in the video that initial interaction where the receptionist, that interaction alone could be enough to send a client out of your agency if they feel like they're not going to be respected or provided the services that they need. So making sure that you get to train all of the members of your agency on LGBTQ inclusivity is important, not just for the clients, but also for staff members who may be a part of the LGBTQ community. You also want to ensure that your organization has a non-discrimination policy that covers gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And finally, it showed it really well in the video. Do your forms, your office spaces, your outreach material, do they reflect a range of sexual and gender identity expressions? So in the follow-up email, I'm also going to send out the Northwest Network has an organizational audit. And so you can take that at your leisure and reflect on how your agency can be perceived if members of the LGBTQ communities came to access services from your agency. The audit's a really straightforward look and can give you some good indicators as to ways that you could make your work environment more inclusive. So I'm now going to turn it over to Teresa Rainey from the DC Office of Human Rights to discuss DC civil rights laws and the LGBTQ community. Teresa?
All right, good morning. So thank you so much. I was just thinking that video is probably enough to take someone out of your office and into my office. So on that note, I'm with the Office of Human Rights, and we are the enforcement agency for DC's civil rights laws. So our mission is to eradicate discrimination and make sure that everyone gets equal opportunity and treatment regardless of who they are and how they identify. And we do that by investigating complaints of discrimination filed, which can be filed for free. No one needs to have an attorney to go through our process. We investigate the complaints, and if we find that discrimination occurred, our Commission on Human Rights can order penalties. So I'm just going to talk about some of the main civil rights law that we enforce, and a few others as well, just so that you're aware. The first law here, the DC Human Rights Act, is again DC's city civil rights law. So we are part of city government, and this is building off of the work of the 1967 Civil Rights Act passed nationally in response to the civil rights movement. So here at the city level, we've expanded the protections from that federal law, and our office enforces that law. And just so you're aware, we also enforce several other laws, mainly dealing with employment. But just keep in mind that we do enforce the Language Access Act of DC, which is a conversation for another day, but just be aware that we are the enforcement agency for that law as well. So for the DC Human Rights Act, again, the civil rights law in DC, that law prohibits discrimination in these 4 different areas: housing, employment, public accommodations, and educational institutions. And it gives us authority to investigate complaints over both DC government as well as the private sector. So our only exception is the federal government and a few federally regulated entities like the metro system. So also keep in mind that we don't investigate complaints of discrimination filed against DC's MPD unless it's in the realm of employment. So the Office of Police Complaints would handle other issues with MPD as far as how they provide services or treat the public. So just keep in mind there's a separate enforcement agency for that. So today I'll just be focusing mainly on the areas of public accommodations, because almost any service provider in DC is going to come under that public accommodations law, and we would have authority to investigate complaints against those service providers if a member of the public tried to access their services and felt that they received a hostile response, such as we saw in the video, or were flat out denied service. And if your agency provides any type of housing, we may also have jurisdiction under the housing section of the DC Human Rights Act as well. So that could include temporary housing, transitional housing, permanent housing, etc. So keep in mind we have those dual protections when you're a service provider in DC if you provide housing, or just the one public accommodations if you're providing other services. So for someone to file a discrimination complaint with our office, obviously we need some kind of discriminatory incident to have happened. Again, that video was a great example. And the discrimination needs to be based on one or more of those protected traits that are listed under the DC Human Rights Act. And this is a great time to remind you of that great presentation on intersectionality. Sometimes there's more than one protected trait that's involved in a discrimination complaint. Those protected traits can be actual or perceived. So if I perceive someone to be transgender and discriminate against them because of that perception, it's not important in that moment whether or not the person is transgender. The point is that I perceive them to be, and that's why I committed that discrimination. The incident must have occurred here in DC for my office to have enforcement authority. Now, if someone is calling you from outside of DC, if you are here in DC responding to that call and providing that service from your work here in DC, we're still going to have authority over what happens. And complainants have 1 year to file a complaint from when that discrimination occurred when we're talking about public accommodations or housing. So, now I don't typically use this slide for the general public, but because you work in domestic violence, I know that you're a little bit more familiar with the law. So I'm going to trot out the legal language a little bit. So when we're talking about discrimination, what we're talking about is either disparate or different treatment. So the negative action was based on one or more of those traits. And we're also sometimes talking about disparate impact. So that's when the policy has a negative impact on certain protected groups, even when the policy looks like it would be neutral. But when it's actually used and played out, it has that negative effect. So I think a great example from that video is those intake forms. So sometimes intake forms, if they're language is such that certain groups feel excluded, that could potentially lead to a disparate impact claim of discrimination. And finally, we do see many retaliation cases that are filed. So keep in mind when someone either comes to our office and files a civil rights complaint, or if they simply voice a civil rights concern to an agency, maybe to their service provider, saying, I feel like I'm being treated differently, maybe because I'm a lesbian here, and I feel like I'm being denied services, or I'm being treated in a hostile way. Whether or not they've filed a complaint or voiced their complaint to the agency, if retaliation happens because they took that action, that could be illegal as well. So they could file a separate retaliation complaint with our agency saying I was engaging in the protected activity of asserting my civil rights, but I was retaliated against because of it. So typically for those cases, we'll see that people are terminated from programs or subjected to additional hostility. And it doesn't matter for retaliation complaints whether or not the original issue turns out to, when we investigate, when it turns out that that actually was based on discrimination or not. If retaliation happens, that's a separate offense, and we'll investigate that separately. So keep in mind that those are the three types of complaints of discrimination that we see. And these are the 19 protected traits under DC's Human Rights Act. I'll just go through them all quickly. Of course, race, color, national origin, those are from the original Civil Rights Act as well. Sex, religion, including lack of religion, age, 18 and up, so all adults in DC are covered under age discrimination law. Marital status, so single, divorced, etc. Personal appearance, so I think Sam had also mentioned that beautiful people get hired more. That may be true, but that could also mean that someone who's not hired because of their appearance could file a personal appearance discrimination complaint. And we also tend to see those around things like height, weight, hairstyle, tattoos, piercings, just the external appearance of someone. As we're talking about today, sexual orientation and gender identity or expression have been protected since 2007, so over almost a decade. Familial status, whether or not you have a child in the home. Family responsibilities, which can mean whether or not you're taking care of someone who's dependent on you. So that can include a child, or that you have a child support order that you pay, or that you take care of someone who's in your home, maybe an older adult. Matriculation simply means whether or not you're an adult student. Political affiliation, I think, is probably pretty well known to folks here in DC. Genetic information, that is not protected under housing law. That's the only exception for housing, but simply whether or not you have a certain genetic code. Disability, which includes not just physical and obvious disabilities, but also more invisible disabilities, could be HIV status, diabetes, bipolar disorder, being in active recovery from drug or alcohol addiction. That's a very wide definition of disability under civil rights law. Source of income, so simply wherever someone's legal source of income is from, could be, of course, a paycheck, could be TANF, crime victims compensation, rapid rehousing subsidy, etc. Status as a victim of an interfamily offense. You probably are very familiar with those rules protecting victims of DV, etc., from housing discrimination. But keep in mind that status as a victim is not protected under public accommodations law. And then place of residence or business. So those are those 19 protected traits, but again, someone might be filing based on one or more of those traits, depending on why they felt the discrimination happened. So this is just an example of an ad we ran to remind folks of the sexual orientation protections in DC, saying you're protected no matter whose hand you hold. And then we've been working a lot over the years with the trans community who have continued to voice, despite having these laws on the books protecting them from discrimination, that of course it is still very rampant here in DC and of course across the country. So in 2012, we ran this campaign called the Trans Respect Campaign, just to raise awareness of the trans community in DC and remind everyone that gender identity and expression are protected from discrimination, and to just humanize the issue as well. And we ran it with several different folks from DC, and this is one of them. And Sam had talked about restrooms as well. So we do enforce the provisions in DC law that allow people to use the restroom that they identify with. So as a cisgender woman, I would use the women's restroom. Transgender women would use the women's restroom as well. People who are gender nonconforming use the restroom that they most identify with and or feel safest using. So if it's a multi-stall restroom, everyone should be allowed access. And if a business were to deny someone access, that person could file a public accommodations complaint against the business. Now, for single-user restrooms, there is a separate rule saying if it's a single-user restroom where only one person goes in, there's only one toilet, etc., those restrooms should all be marked in a gender-neutral way, just saying restroom, for example, instead of male or female. And that is to make those restrooms safer for the trans and gender nonconforming communities to use, because there's less danger of hostility happening if they're using a restroom that is not marked in a gendered way. So if you see a restroom, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's out in public, in a restaurant, etc., that has a single-user restroom that is marked male or female, that's probably not compliant with the law. Feel free to either email me, and I will make sure they get it changed. You can tweet us using the hashtag SafeBathroomsDC, or you can fill out a quick online form on our website and report that to us. And again, we'll reach out and make sure that they become compliant so that these restrooms become safer spaces for everyone. And this is one of our ads just letting people know about the campaign. And then real quick, I just want to mention, although this doesn't apply in public accommodations, that employment discrimination still continues to be a huge issue that we hear about from the trans community. Again, despite the protection being on the books, that doesn't mean that's the reality. So we did a testing project last year where we sent out many fake resumes to different DC employers. The more qualified resumes were marked as coming from transgender applicants, usually using different names. So we would title a resume, for example, Mark parentheses Melissa Robinson, to indicate that the person had changed their name. And we would send those more qualified trans resumes out first, and then we would follow them up with less qualified cisgender applicant resumes to see what the response would be from the employers. And unfortunately, we did see a very high rate of potential discrimination against the more qualified transgender applicants, 48%. So just keeping in mind that this is, I think, probably just the tip of the iceberg as far as the discrimination being experienced in the employment realm. All right, so if someone does feel that they need to file a complaint with us, they fill out a simple questionnaire. Again, the process is free. They don't need an attorney. The questionnaire is not the legal document. That's simply a quick way to let us know what happened and why they think it happened. Because for us with discrimination law, The why is extremely important. Then they come in for an intake interview where we make sure we have jurisdiction over the case and draft up the charge. So that's very similar to helping someone fill out a TPO. And then we take care of service. So we will always be the ones serving the respondent, whether it's the service provider, employer, etc., with a copy of the charge. And after that, we bring in both sides for mandatory mediation to see if we can settle the complaint with an agreement. Oftentimes that agreement will involve financial restitution. It could also be an apology. Sometimes that's really all someone wants when something so personally humiliating has happened to them. They want the other party to acknowledge the harm they did. Or it can include mandatory training for that provider. If the parties cannot agree on a settlement and mediation, the case is sent to investigation, and we have the power to subpoena records and witnesses from both sides to try and find out, again, from both sides what happened and why. Once we have as much as we can gather in the investigation, we make a decision on whether or not there's probable cause to believe that discrimination occurred. So that's the legal standard we use. That's a pretty low bar for a legal standard. It's not like a criminal case where it's beyond a reasonable doubt. If we feel there's no probable cause, the case is dismissed, and either side can appeal that to the DC Superior Court. If we feel there is probable cause, we send the case for a full public hearing to the DC Commission on Human Rights, and then they hold a final hearing. And if they agree that discrimination happened, they will order the penalties, which will usually at that point be financial restitution. And those orders are appealable to the DC Court of Appeals. And that final hearing is the only stage at which the complaint becomes public record. If it settles, for example, in mediation or is dismissed as no probable cause, it remains confidential. Confidential of appeals. And that's just one of our intake forms. And I'm going to go ahead and skip this slide because I know others have to talk, but thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, Teresa. So now we have built a common vocabulary. We understand some of the legal protections for gender identity and sexual orientation in DC. So we're now going to talk about the best practices for collecting SOGI data. So to start out, when should the agency collect the information? Best practice is just like most agencies do, collect the information on intake forms, preferably prior to meeting with the practitioner. This way, the practitioner has all of the information that they need to appropriately address the client when they're going to bring them back for an interview. If you don't do intake paperwork, you can also, staff who meet with the clients can ask the SOGI questions during their client visit. We saw in the video that the medical professional, the doctor, asked about the gender pronouns that the woman preferred, and so that can also happen during the interview. You would want that to happen at the beginning, so you can set that standard immediately. Where should the information go on the intake sheet? It should go alongside race and ethnicity and income information, so right at the beginning of the intake sheet. At what age should we start collecting data? For gender identity, you can collect data at all ages. We've seen in the media, there are a lot of videos and stories about young children who come out as transgender, and so we want to make sure that we're recognizing the gender identity of folks of all ages. It's recommended to start collecting sexual orientation information for folks that are 12 and older. And then what data should be collected? Ideally gender identity and sexual orientation data. And then best practice is also to collect gender pronouns and the preferred name on the intake forms. And we're going to take a look at a couple of example ways that you could ask this on your intake sheets. One thing that some agencies have found as they have begun introducing SOGI data collection in their organizations is to have an optional information sheet or a release form as a cover page to their data collection. This is an example that was taken from a healthcare facility. This is when they started making the transition to collecting SOGI data, so moving to a more inclusive language. You can see there's why is the demographic information being collected. Also, how do I know if I choose the correct information? Who will see this information? This can be really helpful for agencies, so the staff are inundated with questions around changes. If you have clients that are coming in for multiple appointments and all of a sudden the data has changed. Folks might have questions. So this lays out that information up front. It also gives great information in terms of the confidentiality of who is going to get access to this information. I think sometimes we take for granted that some folks may not be out, either in terms of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, to friends or family or community members. So there are very real worries as to who is going to have access to this information. And so you can take care of some of those fears before we ever ask any data by providing one of these top sheets. So to collect gender identity information, this is what I've seen as best practice. It's called a two-step model for gender identity collection. So the first question is, what is your current gender identity? And you see there's a variety of options that folks can choose from. There's also a place that allows for individuals to fill in an additional category. So if they don't feel like their gender identity is captured in any of the options, Sam pointed out two-spirit earlier in the presentation. Maybe that's what their gender identity is, and it's not listed on this form, so they can fill that in appropriately. It also asks, what sex were you assigned at birth? This again is to help provide some clarifying information for the data collection. We talked about best practices. We saw it on the video in the intake sheet. They asked for the client's preferred name. You can also ask for pronouns on intake sheets as well. That way, when folks come to get clients from the waiting room, maybe they need the legal name because they're a medical provider and that's the name that's on their insurance card, but they also have the preferred name so that they can accurately call to the client without misgendering or misnaming the client. And pronouns also are helpful so that you know what pronouns to use when you're interacting with the client. And you can also collect this information in the intake as well, as opposed to on the forms if you prefer that method. Collecting sexual orientation information. Folks can choose if they identify as lesbian, gay, or homosexual, straight or heterosexual, bisexual or pansexual, asexual. A couple of these terms I don't think Sam discussed in depth, but I'm going to be providing a copy of the presentation to folks in the email, so you can review that information as well. Asexual, again, we can include a different category if they don't see their sexual orientation reflected in the data that we have provided. They can write in their own, or don't know. Some considerations for young people, and this could be for young people or for individuals who might not be familiar with the language that we're using around gender identity and sexual orientation. So you can make modifications to the language in the intake forms that you use. You want to avoid using overly complex or jargony language. You can see in this example, they actually provide a brief definition to some of the terms. So in the first example, please choose the one best fitting response. When a person's sex and gender do not match, they think of themselves as transgender. Sex is what a person is born. Gender is how a person feels. So those definitions can help with folks with populations that these terms might not be used in their general vernacular. And then it asks, are you transgender? And then at the bottom, what sex were you assigned at birth? Or what did the doctor put on your birth certificate? That's very straightforward, and most folks should be able to answer that question. Other commonly asked questions. So SOGI data can change over time. It's not stagnant. As you build relationships with clients, or they begin to trust you or your agency more, they might feel more comfortable discussing their gender identity or their sexual orientation with you. At the same time, during the course of the time that you're working with a client, their sexual orientation or their gender identity might change. So best practices allow for a client's sexual orientation and gender identity information to be updated. Maybe you can have them fill out a new form every time they come in. You want to make sure that you leave space for those changes to happen so that folks can be accurately represented, both in their interactions with your staff and with the data that you're collecting as well. Also, making mistakes. For folks who this is new to their language, we saw it again in the video, folks are going to make mistakes, whether that's accidentally misgendering someone or using the wrong name, using the wrong pronoun when referring to someone's partner. It's going to happen. Make sure you apologize and be respectful. And again, practice makes perfect. So once you start becoming familiar with the terms that we discussed earlier in the presentation and practicing, it'll become more familiar and you'll be more used to asking questions and listening before you start making statements. So finally, we're going to move to Whitman Walker Health has been collecting SOGI data, and they recently in January updated the data fields that they have been collecting. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy Nelson to talk about Whitman Walker SOGI data collection.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and I think Paige, Sam, and Teresa did a great job of providing an introduction to this material, and I'm happy to share how it is that we implement these data points in our work. So for those of you who don't know Whitman Walker, we are a federally qualified community health center, and we serve folks with all sorts of medical needs, primary medical needs, but we grew out of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the district, so we have a specialty practice related to HIV work and LGBT care. So this first slide talks about the different services we offer. That includes, we have a research department, we offer dental services, medical, legal services, behavioral health. We have a community outreach, health, and education group. We do HIV testing, we have a pharmacy, and we also offer something we're very proud of called medical adherence or medical case management. And so that is where a medically trained person, a nurse or a community health worker will help folks overcome barriers related to their chronic health needs. So I'll talk specifically about what we do in legal. We have had legal services in-house since 1986 when we were helping folks deal with some serious end-of-life considerations. Over the past 30 years, we've expanded to offer services related not only to end-of-life planning, but generally services targeting low-income people and their attempts to access healthcare. So that includes public benefits, immigration, medical privacy, a lot of discrimination work, insurance navigation, consumer rights, and of course name and gender changes. And in 2015, 1 in 3 of our legal clients identified as non-heterosexual. Of course, we know that because we're gathering SOGI data. And 1 in 5 of our clients last year identified as transgender. So last year we served about 2,500 individuals, and 500 of those folks identified as trans individuals. And by comparison, on the medical side, last year our medical providers served over 1,000 trans-identified adults. So I want to talk a little bit about our data, our SOGI data, and how we do it. We do it at the first intake contact that someone has with our program, and that can be done either in person, over the phone, or at a walk-in clinic. So we have a name and gender change clinic where folks show up and fill out a piece of paper. And in all of those intake practices, we ask folks about their preferred names, we ask them for their legal name, we ask about their preferred pronouns, and I'm going to talk more about those fields in a minute. But as Paige said, we are very much interested in recognizing that those fields can change for folks in the course of our relationship with them. Of course, because we're helping people file for and pursue name changes, someone's preferred name may soon become their legal name in the course of our working together, and that becomes incredibly important when we're dealing with different government programs, both local and federal. So in general, getting back to our data collection efforts, we ask people about their income, their HIV status, housing stability, veteran status, immigration status. All of these things can be relevant in one way or another to the work we're doing. And then, of course, we ask about SOGI data. So, as Paige mentioned, we updated our SOGI fields at the beginning of 2016. On this slide, you can see on the left side the way we used to capture that information. So it was pretty basic back for the last couple of years. So we asked folks on the gender side if they identified as trans, female to male, that's what FTM stands for, or transgender MTF. And then we had unable to obtain male and female. On the sexual orientation question, we asked if they were bi, hetero, or homosexual, or they could decline to answer. I'm a little bit embarrassed that we were still using that information as late as the end of 2015 because I think we all felt a little bit odd using the terms, using the one particular term, homosexual. Plus, we recognized that we simply needed to modernize our categories. And so, basically, we sat down, and I'll talk more about our process, but we sat down with a variety of staff, with a variety of backgrounds, and wanted to find out what people felt like would be the best improvements to suit our client base. We also looked at some national papers that have been released talking about the collection of SOGI data. It's interesting because SOGI data, the terms that are relevant and they're preferred by different communities will vary across communities, both regionally and culturally. So we made great efforts to make sure that our categories dealt with our best responded to our client base. So getting to what we ended up with for gender identity, we asked folks if they identified as male or man, female or woman, or gender queer, non-binary, or something else. And whatever that something else could be, there's a blank field, a blank text field, where the intake person can complete that. Now you'll notice under gender identity, we did not ask if someone identifies as trans, and that is because with our population and also our gender queer staff and our trans staff, the consensus was that a trans person's gender identity is sometimes not trans, and generally that shouldn't be the focus of the intake question, but rather we should ask folks if where they are on the spectrum, male, female, or gender queer, non-binary, somewhere in the middle, and that we should deduce trans status in other ways. And so we get on to the next field, which is asking folks about their sex assigned at birth. And then we ask folks about their preferred pronouns. We have a lot of folks who prefer they because they identify as non-binary or somewhere in the middle. On the sexual orientation side, we broke it out. Well, the first choice actually is lesbian, gay, same-gender loving, which is a growing term. The second choice was straight or heterosexual. The third choice is bisexual, pansexual. And then, of course, someone can answer in another field, a free text field. We intend to add asexual as a choice because a lot of our clients simply are not feel most comfortable with that label. And then the trans category is something that we don't ask the client directly, but rather the staff deduces if someone's sex assigned at birth does not match with their gender identity, which you might think of as their gender presentation, but it's really their self-identified gender identity. So it can't be deduced simply by their physical appearance. But anyhow, if their sex assigned at birth does not correlate to their gender identity, then we fill out this category, either assigned male at birth, assigned female at birth, or not applicable for someone who does not identify as trans. We created this last field in part so that we could run reports and easily pull out our number of trans-identified clients. So why is this important and why did we do it? We did it for a variety of reasons, both internal and external. Programmatically, of course, our number one priority here in legal services at Whitman Walker is to serve our clients' needs with the utmost respect and competency. And so the number one reason we did this was to improve our client experience. Second, we wanted to track community needs, both legal and non-legal, and that's so important for a group like us where we're interacting with not only other Whitman Walker departments, but also other community groups like Teresa's group and groups like HIPS and Casa Ruby, where we want to know what needs are coming up for our clients so that we can grow those relationships and provide better referrals and connections to those other non-legal services. Also, it's important for us because we want to train volunteers appropriately, and of course we want to conduct outreach that reaches our clients in need, and we want to recognize where we might be missing groups. So collecting SOGI data allows us to see the trends, but also look for some of the holes. So I'm happy to say, the results have been very well received. These changes, it's increased our accuracy. Most importantly, it increased the trust and comfort level between staff and clients, which in so many of our legal situations, and I'm sure many people on the call, you're dealing with folks who have lived through some trauma and are somewhat wary of outside service providers, and so building that comfort level is so important. And then finally, being able to meet our clients' needs to the best of our ability. So this is my last slide. As I mentioned, I'll talk about the process. We tried to include people from a variety of backgrounds, not only lawyers, but also some research people, some medical people, some behavioral health people, some folks who identified as trans, some as genderqueer, and then folks along the spectrum of sexual orientation. And after several meetings and a lot of discussion, we ended up for those categories. So with that, I will turn it back over to Paige.
Thank you so much, Amy. Great. So we are going to finish up today with some final considerations for you and your agency when you're considering starting to collect SOGI data. So privacy and confidentiality, this is something that has been reiterated a few times throughout the presentation. We want to make sure that we are transparent with the clients as to who's going to be able to have access to that information. We talked about the top sheet that you can put on that provides that information to clients. You'd want to reiterate what your confidentiality standards as an agency are, but that's going to be a huge piece of concern for many clients when they think about disclosing this information to you. Another piece to consider in terms of privacy and confidentiality in that same vein is if you're going to be reaching out to clients. So if you're going to be doing home visits or you're going to be calling clients or sending emails to clients, you want to confirm how they want to be communicated with outside of the agency. So they may not be out to friends and family. They may not be out to their neighbors. So you want to see what names and what gender pronouns and how they want to be identified in external communications. So again, you can make sure to respect their privacy and confidentiality, because you may have built up a relationship with them where they feel safe sharing their sexual orientation or gender identity with you, but that doesn't mean that it's still safe for them out in the community. Many agencies send bulk mailings. So, you have an event coming up, things that you can do as an agency, making sure that you use generic headers. So instead of saying, Dear Mr. Roberts or Dear Mrs. Roberts, put Dear Supporter, making it general. So again, one, you don't misgender or misidentify the names of the clients that you're working with. But also it's just best practice, again, that confidentiality piece. You don't know who's going to have access to those documents or who's going to be picking up the phone on the other end. Practicing your terminology, not just practicing the language that we talked about earlier, but also thinking about formulating responses to questions that you might get meeting with clients. So possible, sometimes clients might read the intake forms and they might actually not identify themselves as a part of the LGBTQ community or spectrum, but they want to ask you what that means. And so an example question, what do you mean by gender nonconforming? Or what do you mean by transgender? Being ready to answer those questions and practicing your language around answering those questions, either at an individual level or at an institutional level. You want to have formulaic answers and making sure that you train your staff with that information. So checking your data, this is a big one, especially when we're talking about you're reporting your PMI outcomes. Making sure that you can identify the difference between missing values and unknown values. So all the clients that the agencies that are on this webinar are going to be working with have probably experienced some type of traumatic incident very recently or relatively recently. And so we've all seen clients that have skipped over certain questions on their intake assessments, making sure that if they do skip over questions, that the staff person who's going to be meeting with them goes back to check to see if they just happened to not see the question because they were rushing through the form, or whether they intentionally did not check off those values. Because that information is important and it can be helpful to your relationship with your client. We don't want to force clients to disclose information that they do not want to disclose, but we do want to confirm that we're getting all of the information that they are voluntarily willing to disclose to us. So in terms of your data analysis, you want to do quality checks, making sure that you're comparing your intake sheets to the data that's entered into electronic databases, especially if you have default values. So if your default value for your client is woman or female, making sure that the intake forms and the database match, because a lot of agencies are pulling their data directly out of their databases. Completeness, how does the completeness of the data compare to other demographic information? Are folks skipping over the gender identity or the sexual orientation question more or less than they're answering questions around race or ethnicity or their household income? That can be helpful as an agency when you're looking at making changes to your intake forms or working with your clients. And then look for patterns of either incorrect or incomplete data. You don't know if it's a process error, if it's a user error. If you do see that sexual orientation or gender identity information is overwhelmingly being skipped, checking and seeing where that's happening, when that's happening. That will help you identify where those gaps are in the data so that you can identify and address those errors in the workflow. Organizational communication. For agencies that have multiple departments or for organizations where multiple people are going to be working with the same client, making sure that you have some type of interdepartmental communication. So if someone discloses their gender identity or sexual orientation to one person, that we're not having them have to redisclose multiple times to multiple people. So how do you share information? How can you make sure to appropriately share preferred names, preferred gender pronouns, so that clients, when they enter into your agency, can have a smooth experience in terms of those aspects of their identity. And then also creating a feedback mechanism for staff about the changes in data collection. Staff are the ones that are going to be implementing it. If they have any questions or concerns, or if they see any patterns that would be helpful to address in whatever way that you're collecting that data, making sure that you have a formalized way to get that information from those direct service staff. They're going to be the ones who are going to be working with the clients and collecting the information. And ultimately, they're going to be the experts on what's working well and what's not working well, or any issues that they themselves might have around that data collection. So the last couple of slides, so all the presenters' contact information is up on this slide. I'm also going to be emailing it out as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there is going to be an evaluation. Please fill it out. And at the end of this email, I'm also going to email out a list of resources that were referenced in this presentation, as well as a link to that video. I think it was a really helpful tool for many of us as presenters and could be helpful for you within your agency when you're talking about transitioning to collecting SOGI data. So thank you all so much for participating, and I look forward to getting your feedback. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself